Self-awareness is among the most mysterious of cognitive capabilities, described as arguably the most fundamental issue in psychology, from both a developmental and evolutionary perspective. Part of the complexity is the lack of consensus on the definition of the term self-awareness. Philosophers and psychologists have long debated what constitutes and defines the self. There have been different attempts to define sense of self, which have included the autobiographical sense of self, an awareness of oneself as a consistent entity through time, defined by personal memories and experiences. The embodied sense of self, an awareness of oneself as a separate body, along with body awareness. And the social sense of self, an awareness of the self as an individual amongst other individuals within a social group or society. A sense of self is a fundamental part of being an animal and is vital for our most fundamental functions of self-preservation, which is why the same brain regions thought to be responsible for sense of self in humans are shared with other species. The posterior cingulate cortex is thought to play a role in shaping one's sense of self. The cingulate cortex is a hub of cognitive and emotional control, and it is highly preserved across mammals. Much of our knowledge on cingulate cortex relies on a synthesis of findings across species. Two areas of the brain that are important in retrieving self-knowledge are the medial prefrontal cortex and the medial posterior parietal cortex. The posterior parietal cortex is a major associative region in the mammalian cortex, considered to be associated with cognitive functions, such as episodic memory in humans and rodents. Episodic memory is the collection and recollection of personal experiences that creates our autobiographical sense of self. It is constantly being updated with new subjective experiences that make up our personal view of the world. The posterior parietal cortex represents past sensory history and influences behavioral outcomes upon current experience. Animals refer to related past experiences when processing sensory inputs and compare current experiences, either implicitly or explicitly, with prior experiences. The ability to reflect on our past experiences is directly linked to our ability to reflect on ourselves. Self-reflection is associated with the posterior parietal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex, brain regions we share with other species. The insular cortex is also thought to be involved in the process of self-reference. This is a portion of the cerebral cortex within each hemisphere of the mammalian brain. These fundamental brain regions are shared across species, from monkeys to mice. So it's not surprising that fundamental traits such as self-reflection and self-recognition are also shared. Different species rely on different predominant senses to recognize self and others. Animals whose predominant sense is smell build their mental images of the world, largely based on scent. They can use smell to build and replay memories of places, things, and individuals, and replay unique events in sequential order. They can recognize their own scent and the scent of other individuals, and build a mental image of self and others through scent. They can incorporate multiple odors into their memories of an individual, suggesting a mental representation of familiar individuals. The ability to form a mental image of others and of self is a fundamental trait, which has now been proven in rats. Studies have proved that rats can imagine themselves doing something they have not yet done, which requires self-awareness and a mental image of self. To imagine is one of the remarkable things that humans can do. Now we have found that animals can do it too. Our first aim was to understand the recent neural evidence that animals can project themselves into the future. What we wound up understanding is that in order to do so, they must have a primal sense of self. Because other species share the same brain regions, they share this ability to imagine the future. The hippocampus, used for memory, imagination, and future planning, is remarkably conserved across species, including humans, non-human primates, pigs, rodents, and bats. And it's also present in birds. The ability to plan for survival in the future by remembering the past requires the concept of a future self and a perception of time. Researchers are beginning to understand the complexity of time perception and future planning ability in other species. They found that when squirrels are deciding whether to store food for later, they're not just assessing its nutritional value, but also its perishability and shelf life for the future. They also consider the availability of food at that time and the presence or absence of competitors. Time perception has now been shown to exist across the species. When coupled with an episodic memory system, time perception becomes evidence for an autobiographical sense of self in the past, present, and future.